wrote for me.
That's right. And you're not playing.
Which I'm not playing, sorry.
So, anyway, without further ado, please take it away.
All right, so this, we're just going to play it right out of the gate. This first tune is called Chromatic Foxtrot. It's from 1924, and it's composed by George Hamilton Green. Ready? Yeah. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. mid-1920s, and one of the kind of amazing things about just that era in music history, as it were, was you had, World War I had ended in 1918. Think about that. And so America was sort of ready to, party again. It was a really horrible 4 years worldwide. And then on top of that, you had, Tin Pan Alley, all this music being written, all this music being composed, and you had this opportunity for people to be able to play this music. Dance bands, right? If you think about those early dances, the two-step, the foxtrot, the Charleston, I'm sure you've all heard of these types of dances. Maybe you haven't specifically seen them, but I think those names sort of ring a bell in your ear with all that stuff. You had George Hamilton Green, who was this sort of amazing, virtuosic, young composer, and was actually violinist and pianist. He was born in 1893 in Omaha, Nebraska, and his dad was a band leader in Omaha, Nebraska. So you immediately had like an outlet. As soon as you learned how to play something, he could play in the band, and he did. It wasn't until he was about 10 years old that he found what was called, at that time, a straw fiddle, which was really a really sort of early form of the xylophone. And in fact, it didn't go kind of left to right like a piano keyboard. It went front to back. And so I don't know if you've seen pictures of them where the bars are this way and you sort of play them like that. And they're called straw fiddles because they literally put them on a bale of hay to help with the resonance of those instruments. And we were talking really, really early instruments. And he fell in love with just playing that instrument. And it ended up being his tour de force of how he wanted to make his name as a musician. He actually had an older brother named Joe Green, who was also a pretty famous xylophonist in his own right. They both played the xylophone. Sadly, Joe died really young, and it wasn't, it was right at that time when Joe passed away that this music was really kind of taking off. And so George sort of took that torch that him and his brother sort of created together. He's the one that we really know now as percussionists and xylophonists, as the one who sort of wrote a bunch of music and recorded a bunch of music as well. With the recording aspect, again, they call the 1920s the golden age of the xylophone. Well, why is that? Well, part of it is because recording technology was also just sort of coming into its own in the U.S. Thomas Edison, the Victor Victrola, those early machines, just like that, and we'll get a sample of what that sounds like in just a minute, but those machines were becoming more affordable. So people who, in their 20s, had families, and they were looking for entertainment sources, you either had a piano, but at that time the grand pianos were really expensive, or these machines were becoming more and more affordable. So people were buying those machines. And of course, if you have something like that, you need something to play, to listen to. Because the early recording technology, the ability to actually record sound, was not nearly what it is today, there were very few instruments that actually sounded really good on these early wax cylinders. One of them, in fact, was the xylophone. And it's because of that really articulate sound, it was literally being carved into the wax on those cylinders. So it made a deeper groove, and it was easier to actually make a recording of a xylophone than, say, a violin or a human voice, which didn't really have that articulate type of sound quality to it. So many of these early recordings were for xylophone. And all these recording companies, Edison, Victor Victrola, his master's voice, they all had resident musicians that worked for the record company. And they would literally, in a day, record the same song over and over again, so they'd have as many master takes of that as they could have. And so they would just have on staff, George Hamilton Green was on staff with Victor Victrola. He'd go into work and he would play what I just played, Chromatic Foxtrot, 100 times, right? And then they'd have those and they could make more recordings from those recordings. And so it was really, people wanted them, you wanted to buy them, there was a demand, there was a need, there were jobs, people wanted to dance, people wanted to go out. Kids your age, adults your age, when you would go on dates, you were going dancing. The guys were getting dressed up in suits, girls were getting in their best, outfits, and they'd go dancing. They go to dance halls. That was what, people your age were doing. So you had live music, people playing, xylophones were in those bands, you had the recordings, people listening to those recordings, and you had work for these musicians. And so it was really prolific at this time. It might be great if we hear what these recordings sound like.
And so this was my great-grandfather's. He was a farmer and a carpenter in Central California. So yeah, not rich, but people were able to start getting these things. So this is a 1913 Edison Amberola, and I've got a big old case of the cylinders up in my office. And there's a wide variety of stuff. There were a couple of xylophone ones, but there's a lot of just band, dance band, comedy routines, some of which are incredibly racist. But it was from the time. If you're curious, I could show you sometime. But here's some xylophones.
And I'll just say, this is before, the technology after this, you probably know, 78, regular vinyl, but hard plastic thick. So these cylinders predate that technology. So we're still, again, 1913? 1913.
No electronics, all
spring wound. You see how much clearer that xylophone is than any of the other instruments.
4 minutes of music.
Yeah. Yeah, you think of it, I mean, my generation, when I was a kid, was like, LPs, and so you get like about 30, 35 minutes on a side. And even I thought that was a drag when I was a kid, having to get up and like change, flip the side. Can you imagine like every 4 minutes you want to listen? And that was the whole wax cylinder, so like that was 4 minutes. Then you had a collection of like hundreds of these just to get 2 hours worth of music, in your home. You had all that kind of stuff. So that's what those early sounding, that's what that sounded like early on. And so now, as I said, like these tunes came from like the mid 1920s, and so technology was better, the recordings were better, and of course, more people could then afford the machines. Because as those machines progressed in their ability to build them better, they became cheaper, like in anything else. The more you can mass produce things, the cheaper they are, and so therefore, more people can afford to buy them. And they also had like, penny boardwalks where, you put your penny in, you can listen to it on the, so like there was so much need for this music that it was just kind of everywhere. And in fact, I haven't gone into any antique shops here in Ashland, but most of the times when I go into antique shops and I see like more than, let's say, 100 of those 78, records in there, there's always xylophone ones in there. Without fail, there's always xylophone ones in there, just because of just how much that instrument, was recorded at that time. So, are there any questions about anything so far that we've suggested? We've got some more tunes that we can play for you, but I want to make sure that if anyone has any kind of poignant thoughts.
Comment.
Nothing.
Curiosity.
Yeah.
Why did you say that's called again? The little thing.
Those are just old phonograph players, but those are the wax cylinder ones. I don't know if that has a specific name.
This one was an Amberola. That was like Edison called it.
Right, the model is the Amber.
Yeah, the model, but it's a phonograph. It's
Yeah.
like
The general term of those things. Yeah.
Is there a specific reason that the xylophone is so much clearer than all the other instruments?
Glad you asked that question. Maybe one of these fine people could answer this for us. Please.
It's like, what did you say, quintily tuned?
Yeah, that is the principal difference, quint tuning.
It's tuned to the interval 5 in the overtone series that makes it like much sharper, or like different tuning. It sticks out to other instruments because of that.
Right, so I'll expand on that. So he's right. And so there was this development of tuning instruments like this called quint tuning. So there's a guy named James Calhoun Deegan, who's an American in Chicago. And again, bands, they needed xylophones and glockenspiels, they needed these kind of percussive, keyboard style instruments. And so this is technically not a xylophone in the way that we think of these instruments. This is a marimba. And a marimba is of an African descent through Latin America. Marimba meaning wooden tongue. So these are, hence the name marimba, wooden tongue. Xylophone is Latin. Xylo meaning wooden, phone meaning music. So xylophone. Now technically, as I told them, if you really want to get into the weeds, this could be a xylophone because it is wooden and it is music. So xylophone. But today we sort of say a xylophone is that kind of instrument, a marimba is this kind of instrument. And again, difference between those two, the most important difference isn't really the range, although xylophones tend to be a little bit up in pitch and register. So xylophones, like I have one that goes down to this low C, but not below that. But they did make a 5-octave xylophone by Deegan. And so what that is, he's talking about the overtone series. I'm sure some of you have heard of that sort of idea in music. And when you're tuning a musical, like a bar on a xylophone or on a marimba, you have to tune it to the overtones. And so the first overtone that they tune a xylophone to in modern times is the 5th partial, first. They want to hear that first, which means the next partials come sooner, right? And the 4th, the 3rd, and so on. So it has a bit more of a harsh quality of xylophone, a little more biting quality to it. As opposed to a marimba, they tune the octave first partial, and then the 5th. And so those seconds, thirds, minors, they come later in the sound. So technically, really what we're talking about is a slightly mellower sound on a marimba versus a xylophone. And it's based on that quint tuning. So it's really a scientific thing that's the difference.
Is there also a difference in the resonating tube or no?
No, I mean that really has nothing to do with it. Like you you'll see all kinds of different resonators and all kinds of different instruments. Every company has their own way that they want to do it. 5-octave marimbas sometimes have giant, look like hot rod pipes turned back up, coming off the side of it.
Yeah.
But it's really about how they tune those bars. Yeah, and it became more sort of standardized through Deeg and doing it like the 1920s, 1930s for sure was sort of this quaint tune. But it is confusing. You can find early instruments called xylorimbas, which it's still the mystery of how those things were necessarily tuned or why they were tuned a certain way. So there's all that. That's a great question because you get that a lot. Just don't call either of these instruments vibraphones because that drives people nuts because the vibraphone, of course, is made of metal and it's a pedal. It's a completely different thing. People point at vibraphones and go, look at that nice xylophone. Just call this a xylophone. Make that mistake at the end. Do anything.
Are there any more questions?
Any other? All right, why don't we play another tune? What kind of? Which one? Jovial, right? Yeah. So this next one is called Jovial Jasper, sort of in brackets, a slow drag. And what a slow drag was a form of dance at that time. It was very sort of evocative. You had to hold your partner in close, and you're literally, the lead person is sort of lifting their partner up off the ground and dragging their feet almost. That's why it's called a slow drag. So it's sort of a sensual dance. It's not one of those like this. It's like, coming close and move that way. And because of that, it's a little bit of a down-tempo type tune. This is Jovial Jasper, a slow drag. A 1, 2. So a big part of this art form of playing these tunes is improvising. But it's improvising in that style. You know, when I first wanted to learn, I mean, you can buy these notated charts, they have them, you can buy them, you can learn them as written. And you can play it, you can perform it, great, no problem. Historically, however, improvisation was a huge part of this art form. And so when I played a bunch of these rags as an undergrad at the University of Toronto, and it was just dumb luck that literally like the leading authority on this musical style lived in Toronto. If you're a percussionist, you've probably heard of Bob Becker. He plays in the Nexus Ensemble. He's also a member of the Steve Reich Ensemble. Some of you may have heard of Steve Reich in your music history classes, American minimalist composer. He played in both those groups, and he sort of single-handedly, I mean, I guess I should start with George Hamilton Green. He does his thing, great, party, everyone's into it, music, 1920s, yeah, fabulous. And then technology keeps going, and recording technology gets better, so other instruments can be recorded, they sound better and better. And the instrument itself, the xylophone, in this sort of musical genre of playing ragtime on it, sort of goes the way of the dodo bird. And there was like a famous story where in the 1942, 1943, George Hamilton Green, he's now in his, what would he be, in his 50s. He's in a recording session, he realizes like the vibraphone is now on the scene, jazz is now on the scene. It's like, this is old fashioned, right? People don't, people your age aren't into this anymore. They were, your parents' generation would have been into this, you're not into this anymore. And he, the urban legend goes, he just put his mounts down in a recording session, walked out, and left his instruments, and just literally walked away from all of it, and became a cartoonist. I mean, that is a fact. He became like a really amazing Time magazine, Life, like, he had a whole separate career after this. So then, fast forward, however many years, 40 years or so, it's the 1970s, and Bob Becker stumbles upon some of these charts at the Library of Congress and realizes, like, wow, this is really cool. And so he finds them, he learns a bunch of these, finds the recordings, listens to George play this music, realizes improvisation is a big part of this thing, and teaches himself how to improvise. And then in Nexus, he wrote the accompanying parts. The accompanying parts that they are playing along to me weren't ones that George Hamilton Green composed. He had a piano accompaniment part. These were written by Bob Becker, so that his buddies at Nexus could play with him when he played the solo part, just exactly the same way that we're doing it today. They're playing Bob Becker arrangements of these solo parts. And so, back to the dumb luck part of it, Bob lives in Toronto. And so I called him up and just said, I would love to learn how to improvise, how to learn that aspect of this music. And he said, okay, why don't you come over, we'll do some lessons. And so that was in 1996. And I still go and do lessons with Bob Becker on this stuff whenever I'm back in Toronto. And so, you have to remember, like, I'm trying my best to stay within that time period. Like, bop doesn't exist yet. Like jazz in the way that you might think of it, Art Blakey, all that stuff, it doesn't exist yet. So the chord structure and the harmonic structure of this stuff is still kind of very basic. In the way that we're doing these. There's not a lot of sharp whatevers and flat whatevers. It's just kind of like C6, D7, G9, and E flats. Very sort of basic chord structure changes. And so I would just sort of listen to a bunch of these recordings. I would do transcriptions. George Hamilton Green himself in the 1920s put out some lessons that you could also get, which are still published today in a compilation. So if you do those lessons, you can sort of teach yourself how to do this. But I just started learning how to do this. And so, if you listen to this last tune, let's just play this again, Jovo Jasper, from just do the beginning. But can we start? Do the beginning. We'll do the whole intro. And you'll see, like, the A section is just... Repeat. So it's really just C6, D7, C, a little diminished, turn around, back to G. That's it. That's all that's happening there. So as long as you know that as a performer, you can go crazy, in terms of but stay within that style. So I'm not trying to do way outside of that. I'm trying to do stuff that's pretty much in that. So let's go from the top, and I'll yell out the chord changes and try to improvise at the same time. We'll see what happens. 1, 2, from the top. 2, 3. Sorry, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Throwing in, like, you heard me just play that ragtime rhythm, like that's a big part of what, you know, is definitive syncopation and ragtime. That's what gets you dancing. You know, if I'm just going Frankenstein, I'm trying to dance, you got to hear that rhythm. That's what gets people moving. And so that's what you really need to be able to do, is understand the chords that you're playing. It's the same in jazz. I mean, it's no different, obviously. If you're a jazz player, you're like, duh. I mean, you don't know what chord you're playing.
But chord, if I could.
Yeah. Please.
So, you obviously have some facility with this. So, when you say you know your chords, but you're also really conscious about the scale, the mode. So
yeah.
Are you doing Mixolydian?
I don't know. I don't do modes. Man, my jazz was 25 years ago.
So are you switching at all, or are you seeing the scale?
I'm seeing, like, so when I practice, when I first started practicing this stuff, I would go, okay, C6, and I would literally, like, do as many different ways that I could play C6. But, like, what are the notes of C6? Anyone? Right, so okay, fine. And then I would go, well, okay, what if I, instead of just going, kind of a boring improvisation, so what if you do arpeggiated? So I'm trying to do as many different ways that I can play those chord structures and make them all the inversions, arpeggiated, ragtime rhythms, tripleted rhythms, dotted rhythms. You know, also, like, the flat third is also a big part in this style still. So instead of just going, I'm going that blue note, right? So instead of just outlining C, I'm going. So you can add, you know, like the passing tones. That's still a big part of this improvisational style. It's still within, you know, the musical language of what this is. But it's really just that, you know, those flat thirds, you know, a little bit the flat five sometimes, you know, you just can't get too outside of it. You really, like, it hadn't been invented yet, right? Like, it didn't exist, like, that way of thinking about music. And so you have to, you know, I'm getting in a time machine trying to pretend I'm in 1920. I can't pretend I'm in 1940 playing 1920s, right? I'm trying to play it as traditionally as possible and stay within that style. And so George Henry Green called it noodling. So he would be like, right? It's just playing sort of tripleted through all of those chord progressions. C, D7, G, back C, little turnaround. It's all there. But, you know, I would just really practice. First, can I do this? You know, and I would do that with all of the chord changes that I'm doing it in, the D7s, all of it, right? So I would just become proficient. And then when I'm playing these things, I don't know, I'm sure jazz players, I think the same thing that happens. Like, because this is a very visual instrument, right? Like a piano, looking at a piano essentially, the notes just kind of light up. Like, it's just like, this is where you're at. You know, the D7, you know, an F sharp lights up, and C natural, you know, D all of a sudden, which wasn't lit up when I was doing the C6. Like, it's that kind of thing that I'm seeing as I'm playing it. So, yeah, and so if you really want to get into this stuff, though, you should really try and, you know, the percussionist, I suppose, or any of you that want to get into the ragtime, is be able to really do that improvisational style of the playing. Because that's really I wouldn't say the most important part of it, but it's definitely part of that style.
Questions? Ideas? Comments?
Yeah.
Could you improvise, like, not in ragtime and it still sounds cool?
You mean in these tunes?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, of course you could. I mean, you could do anything you wanted to, but that's not what I'm trying to do. You know what I mean? Like, sound cool. That's like beauty's in the eye of the beholder type of thing. Like, if I did that, if I showed up at a lesson with Bob Becker and did that, he'd be like, no, what are you doing, man? Like, that's not, like, if you're trying to be traditionalist, which is why, I mean, there's a lot of players that do that. And, you know, there's a famous xylophonist on the East Coast who is incredible, that does a lot of that kind of thing, and he's like, wowie zowie. But when you talk to, like, the traditionalists, they're like, but that's not, like, I understand that is really great and difficult, but it's not part of the tradition, you know, in the sense if you're trying to do it traditionally, which is what I'm trying to do. If that makes sense, does that make sense? I'm not saying you couldn't, shouldn't, I'm just saying that's not how I like to do it.
Okay.
It's just a personal thing. I think it's because of my teacher is just like, don't. Like, you know, I'm going to be dead one day. It's like, still has to like stay.
So speaking, I didn't know that Bob Becker wrote all these arrangements.
He did, yeah.
Are these, and then going back to Green, are these his compositions?
Yeah.
So are they, and not, Green didn't make,
He wrote them
arrangements?
on the xylophone.
Okay.
He did not write them for piano. He did not write them for anything, but these are xylophone
not
tunes.
arrangements from older traditional tunes.
Nope. These are brand new compositions that he wrote specifically to be played on the xylophone.
Smarty McSmarters.
Yeah.
Because he keeps all the copyrights.
Well, 75 years is long gone. So.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
We got about 15.
Okay, great. So we've got one more to play, so why don't we do that one? So this next one is called Log Cabin Blues. And interestingly, it has a little sidebar title as well. It's called the Jazzy Ragtime Foxtrot Blues. And you're like, okay, why would it have all of those terms in there? Well, because they're trying to sell this stuff, right? So if you're interested in ragtime or jazz or blues or the dances, then you would think, oh, maybe I'll buy that sheet music. Like, it's all about selling the sheet music. It's all about selling the sheet music. It's all about selling the cylinders, the records. So as many people that you get interested in buying this thing, so if you have all these little subtitles, it's jazz, it's ragtime, it's blues, it's dance, it's this, it's that. It's like, you know, it's like an infomercial of all that stuff at the time. That then, you know, maybe you'll buy it. So this is, what did I say? Log cabin blues. I'll make sure I play the right tune. 1, 2. Interestingly, though, there's a lot of discrepancy on how that term came to be, like the actual word ragtime. A lot of people think it's had to do with the ragged time of the syncopation that you're hearing. Other people say it was some of the ragged clothing that people were wearing at that time in America, Depression era. The jury's kind of out, and then rags is just short for ragtime. I mean, it's sort of a generic term that we use for rags. But it really came into its own, like, I'm sure you've heard of the composer Scott Joplin. So he was kind of like famous, probably Maple Leaf Rag, The Entertainer. 1899, the sheet music to that came out at the Chicago World's Fair, and it sort of blew up. It was kind of like America's first big chart-topping hit, where everyone was just like, I gotta have that, like that's just an incredible tune, I want it. People wanted to play it, people wanted to learn it, people wanted to hear it, but most of this music just existed kind of in, frankly, brothels and, kind of, you weren't going to the hoity-toity classical, music venues to see ragtime. Like it's sort of the same with early jazz, right? You weren't going there either. So it sort of started as sort of the seedy underbelly of America, and then, Joplin himself was trying to elevate the status of ragtime music. I mean, he even wrote an opera that never actually got performed, Premonitia, which never got performed during his lifetime, but has since been performed, I think, at Lincoln Center. They put on a big performance of it. And so, he himself was trying to, elevate the status of that thing, not unlike George Hamilton Green, who was trying to heighten the status of the xylophone itself, which was really kind of a Tin Pan Alley, Broadway, hokey, play it like this, and wink, wink, nod, nod at the crowd type of thing. It wasn't a serious instrument, and he really wanted to do that. I will say quickly as well, he put out a method book, not just the lessons book that I talked about, but he has an actual book that I found a copy of it years ago, where there's pictures of him. I'm going to turn this sideways so you can get an idea. There's pictures of him standing at a xylophone, and it's literally how not to play, pictures the wrong way. He's looking at the camera, the wrong way. It's literally his hands are upside down. Who would think to play like that? Right? But what he was trying to do was create a school of pedagogy for this instrument. There was no pedagogical approach to playing keyboard instruments. And everything that he talks about in that book, through the photos and through his writing, still applies today. It's sort of stand, at this distance. Hold your mouths at about this distance. Don't play up high like that. Keep your low on the keyboard, right? That's for accuracy, that you want to keep your mallets down low. When you're playing what are called double stops, 2 notes at the same time, kind of pinch your fingers a little bit, because you don't want it to flam, you want it to hit at the same time. So he was saying, this is how you want to take this instrument seriously, you want to learn how to play this thing, follow these steps, do my lessons, and I guarantee you success. And he was the guy that sort of did that. And then you had Claromar Musser, who was a famous sort of marimbist. I'm sure the percussionists have heard of him. And he wrote a bunch of more classical compositions as well. And so together, the two of them were really the pedagogical history of how we play keyboard instruments to this day. It all dates back to those individuals. So it is kind of fascinating in that sense, where I wish I brought the photos to show you, because you think who would ever who would ever wrong way, right way.
Was this music ever arranged for or recorded for pianola? Because it's the same time that box was actually the builder of those boxes, the builders of the player.
I don't know. I mean, I'm sure a lot of it ended up on that kind of thing. It's quite possible. George is really famous for 3 things: his playing, his pedagogical approach, and his compositions. And together, those 3 things, really put him on the map in any of those areas. And he was really wealthy by the end of his career, just from sheet music sales, from the recording sales, from the studio recording stuff. And it's kind of sad. I mean, in his mind, he wanted this instrument, the xylophone, to be just like the piano turned out to be in everyone's home, right? At that time, pianos were expensive instruments. It was predating the upright piano, right? So they weren't mass produced yet. You wanted a piano, you were paying big money for a grand piano. You had to have the space. A lot of people didn't have the space in their home or the money. So he was neck and neck with like, buy the xylophone, don't buy the piano, right? And then the piano ultimately ended up winning, sadly. I'm just kidding. But in his mind, he really believed in the integrity of this instrument and really fought, you know. And it's kind of a sad ending to the fact that he realized, like, yeah, it's not happening.
Wow.
it's time to move
When
on.
I'm watching your players play with you, I'm seeing the smiles happen when they're playing, and that I think is the right message.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's really, you know, these charts with this type of standard setup gets played everywhere in the world now. All schools, gets played everywhere now, and so it's great that the music's been resurrected because it's great chamber skills that you got to have, and the parts aren't that hard, and so you guys got to learn how to do these things now.
Any more questions? Over there.
Why do you like Brad?
Oh man, you know why I started? Well, it was the only instrument I actually owned. So long story short, I was playing in this band for a while, and then that all ended, and I thought, okay, what am I going to do? The only instruments I owned at that time were the drum kit that I'd been touring with, and this busted up xylophone. And this was like 4 years after undergrad, and I thought, well, let's try this for a while. And I remembered rags and just started playing it, and it just made me feel good, like it was happy music, you know. This is like the 90s when like grunge and angry and angst and, you know, everyone's unhappy, and I thought, well, this is kind of happy. I need some happiness in my life. And so that's how it went for me. And then, as Derek was saying, I'm playing a lot of times all this like thorny new music, like the Fernie Howe and the Stockhausen and the Xenakis. But I end all of my concerts with ragtime because I feel like if they're gonna sit through all that stuff, at least I can leave them the hall tapping their foot and going, okay, it wasn't so terrible. It's like at least they gave me something that I could, you know, snap my finger to. So it just became a great way to end all the concerts that I did as well. And then I could send the charts ahead of time if I was doing a recital at school, just like you guys, learn them, and then I could come in, and then we can all play together at the end of the concert with we put this together pretty quickly. So